My name is Jason Swanson. I'm the Director of Strategic Foresight here at KnowledgeWorks, and it's really a pleasure to be joining you today. So this conversation is the second in a series of what we've been calling here at KnowledgeWorks the State Transformation Series. And really, this is set up to be a series of conversations with folks that are involved in deep change, making deep change in the field. So when we talk about systems transformation, these are the folks that, for me, come to mind that are really looking at creating sustainable, deep change at a systems level, typically at that state education level. So if you are just joining us for the first time, you can expect a conversation about what's happening in that state around systems transformation. If you're joining us again for the second in the series, thank you very much. We appreciate you coming back. So I will be your host for the duration. Joining me is Sarah Young from the great state of Utah. So Sarah, my first question, I guess it's a fairly softball one, is I'd just like you to introduce yourself.
You bet. Thanks, Jason. And huge thanks to all of our partners at KnowledgeWorks for hosting this opportunity. So to introduce myself, I am Sarah Young. I'm the Chief of Staff at the Utah State Board of Education. I have had the absolute pleasure of being a part of this team here in Utah for the past 10 years. And that includes some of our really initial work into Portrait of a Graduate and building out opportunities for personalized and competency-based learning here over the last 7 years. So excited to be here today and share our journey.
Terrific. So as I approach this work as a futurist, I'm going to say definitively, my favorite question to ask folks is really what they want for the future and for the future of learning specifically. So another way to ask that question is, what is your vision? And the topic of the conversation today will likely center on this idea of collaborative vision. And one of the things that makes me really, really excited in terms of the opportunity to speak to you and both to reflect on the work in Utah is what I would consider a really elegant portrait of a graduate, and more so the process that you all undertook to create that portrait. So I was hoping you could share with us a little bit about that process, so how it came to be, and really what's contained in that portrait of a graduate.
Thank you. So when it comes to Utah's Portrait of a Graduate, I really like the opportunity to share that it was a vision that evolved over time. So there are always those moments where, the spark kind of starts the fire, which ultimately lights the forest fire of change. And I like to look at Utah's Portrait of a Graduate as that initial spark, the item that really set us down a path of innovation, even prior to the pandemic and some of the challenges we faced in response to that. So to give just kind of like a general context setting, Utah's Portrait of a Graduate was designed to identify the ideal characteristics of a Utah graduate after going through the K-12 system. This particular conversation in our state stemmed from a conversation of our State Board of Education related to graduation requirements and trying to figure out what courses need to be taken and what those requirements look like. And instead of kind of defaulting to the existing structure of so many credits in math and so many credits in science, our board decided to take a step back and say, well, wait a minute, before we even get to that level of detail, we really need to discuss what is our expectation of a graduate? What is our expectation of a diploma from a high school here in Utah? And then once we have clarity on that vision, that should inform some of these policy level decisions about the next step for the state. It's important to highlight as well that our state board had also recently adopted the vision you see on the screen, which is that upon completion, all students are prepared to succeed and lead. And we really drive with that vision in Utah in terms of using those two phrases, both succeed and lead, for all of our kids to be able to talk to your question, Jason, about what is our goal for the future. And for us in Utah, it's preparing our kids to succeed and lead in whatever adventures and pathways they choose beyond high school. So as a part of that, I'm going to highlight our portrait of a graduate just to, again, give like a taste of the direction we headed. We decided to group our characteristics into 3 separate categories. The first one being mastery, which I think is the one most people are familiar with. It's the one that when you send your kids to school, you expect them to come home with mastery related to academic content, maybe some civic, financial literacy, even some digital kind of components. Autonomy is going to be where we look and focus on those skills that are necessary to really be able to grapple with some of the kind of ever-changing nature of the society we live in. So this is where we capture what are commonly like the 4 C's or 6 C's or however many C's you subscribe to, looking at things like communication, critical thinking, creativity, and other aspects. Last but not least is purpose. And purpose is one that I'll dive into a little bit more, but it does make our portrait of a graduate a bit unique because it contains elements that we heard from stakeholder feedback were incredibly essential as outcomes of our K-12 education system. These are things that are not necessarily discrete measures. We have items in here like honesty, responsibility, lifelong learning, that we know aren't necessarily something that at a state level there's going to be a test for or an accountability measure for. And so it was a really good conversation for our State Board of Education to grapple with whether to include these items or not. Ultimately, our state board chose to value what we value, not just to value what we can measure. And so based on the feedback from stakeholders, we included these characteristics as well. So you can see in a very high level what each of those categories break down into each of the 13 characteristics that are included on our portrait of a graduate. I've also included a tiny URL to be able to quickly get to our website to be able to download a copy if you're interested. So again, just kind of highlighting where we ended in mastery, we received a lot of feedback that clearly school is designed to be able to achieve academic mastery and that was an expectation of our system, which is why this is our first characteristic in our portrait of a graduate. Very intentional. Second is wellness. Wellness is something that even back in 2018 and moving through the pandemic, we've continued to see this aspect and need in our students rise, not just in terms of wellness, in terms of health or PE or physical education and some of those components, but also that social emotional wellness, the ability to monitor and kind of self-regulate related to emotions and responding to trauma. Next in mastery, you'll see we have the civics, financial, and economic literacy. I always like to call out this characteristic because as part of our stakeholder hearings, we actually talk to recent graduates of the system. So freshmen in our university campuses. And this is the one they called out in terms of a great area of need, which was really in this financial and economic literacy space. They were facing student loan questions, the ability to, be able to create a budget related to their day-to-day needs and things like that. And they were like, if there's one thing I wish I had more of, this would be it. So that really elevated that item. Digital literacy pretty much speaks for itself. The role of technology continues to increase, and we want folks to be able to be familiar with the technology, but also to be able to engage with it in a safe and effective function. Autonomy, communication, we like to call out this characteristic. It's the one characteristic that everyone in the state of Utah agreed upon. We didn't get any negative feedback about this particular aspect being a really vital characteristic for all of our graduates. Critical thinking and problem solving, I like to bucket with creativity and innovation. Those both came from our workforce sectors. We did do a lot of stakeholder interviews with our individual industry leads, as well as our partners in the technical colleges. And they really called out this need to be able to have more flexible thinking in our graduates to be able to meet the needs of an ever-changing industry world. Last but not least, in autonomy, we have collaboration and teamwork. Again, just a really key function in terms of no matter where you go, something that's important. Purpose is where you're going to see those items that, again, aren't necessarily items that we have discrete measures for, but were noted as value within the state of Utah. And we felt it was incredibly important to honor the voice of all the Utah stakeholders who participated and to include these items as expectations of our system and portrait of a graduate. So you'll see we have honesty, integrity, responsibility, hard work, resilience, lifelong learners, service, and respect. All of these components are incredibly important important in Utah. And we wanted to be sure we were starting to have conversations with our teachers and our systems about if these are important to our community members, how are we creating environments that foster these in our kids moving forward? So in terms of then what we did with our portrait of a graduate, just to quickly capture our two big main steps, taking it from that vision one pager to reality. In Utah, we had the pleasure of partnering with KnowledgeWorks as our technical expert to be able to help us develop that portrait of a graduate into tangible competencies. So not just saying this is what it looks like for a graduate, but what does it look like in communication when you're in grades K through 2, 3 through 5, 6, 8, 9, 12, and ultimately post-secondary. Our competencies are really captured around three main characteristics. We hold high expectations for all of our students. We do have an alignment from a pre-K sector all the way through higher education. So we developed it P20, which is why they're called that. And then in addition to that, the competencies were framed around providing students personalized opportunities to demonstrate competency. So not around necessarily saying in order to show competency, you have to earn this grade on this test, but really having more flexible opportunities to develop how you show outcomes related to achieving these characteristics. We also worked with KnowledgeWorks recently and have released our P20 rubrics. These are model rubrics designed to be able to help support our teachers in the classroom, looking at the individual competencies, which you see on the left, and then being able to work with students to be able to identify where are you in terms of demonstrating your competence. We've tried to design these with student-friendly language so that the students are the ones who are actually utilizing these rubrics to be able to move forward for agency. So that's just a quick overview of our portrait of a graduate. So I appreciate the opportunity to kind of set that ground level before we jump into our other questions.
Vision is a wildly powerful guiding force, right? When it's implemented well, right? It is that North Star that guides how we think about the deployment of resources, how we think about the development of new services, products, offerings, partnerships, etc. And I think just as important is the creation of that vision, right? Because if I just sit in my house, come to KnowledgeWorks, say, here's the vision for the organization, the buy-in might be slimmer than I would like, right? So I'm curious to hear about how the portrait developed over time. So you mentioned going from the vision, creating the actual portrait or profile of a graduate. So we could think of that as almost the outcomes of the vision. You'd mentioned a couple stakeholder groups who were part of the process. So freshmen, which I think is brilliant, right? They have the context for thinking differently about some of the things they would change, industry and post-secondary. Who else was involved in that process? What did it look like? Because again, I think this is such a robust portrait that, you know, I know a lot of folks had their hands in this, and this was a huge lift.
Yeah, it's a great question. So we as an agency, really led by our state superintendent, Sydney Dixon, embraced a process of design thinking. So rather than coming into it with, you know, this is our solution and who can we get on board and rally behind the solution, we really wanted to engage in that design thinking as a greater community. So as a part of that, we designed 5 key questions that we took kind of out on the road. We did opportunities for public input, just general open call meetings where individual parents, teachers, educational leaders could come and join. We also took those questions directly to some of the stakeholder groups that we knew were important in terms of our educational leaders, our teacher leaders. We also brought it to our students in our CTE advisory groups, our student advisory group. I'll also share, we did a focus group led by our Assistant Superintendent, Leah Voorhees of Student Supports, specifically with our students in incarcerated schools, and really looking at it through the lens of, you know, where did the system serve you and where did it not? And what are our opportunities to be able to use that information to help inform the creation of this vision over time? So the questions were pretty They weren't targeted at tell me exactly what you want in Portrait of a Graduate, clearly not how you usually approach design thinking. So we tried to ask it through different frames and different lenses to really get at what are some of those key outcomes. One of them was specific to asking all of the individuals, if you were going to hire an individual, what qualities and characteristics do you look for, to be able to kind of get at some of those, needs of the workforce, as well as, those kind of highly important characteristics. We also asked a question that was more personal in terms of a new individual is joining your family. What characteristics do you hope that they bring to the table? That question stands out to me because back to our college freshmen, as they were generating results and sharing with each other, one of them turned to the other after hearing their list of what characteristics they were hoping someone would bring to their family, and said, I could be in your family. And it was so genuine, and it was so refreshing to have them see what characteristics were important to them and which ones they felt they embodied based on their schooling already and what opportunities we still had there.
What a brilliant way to ask that question. And we've played with that sometimes too. But I like the family member aspect. We've thought about, portrait of a lifelong learner, portrait of a neighbor, portrait of a community member. But I really appreciate that. So you laid the vision, you created the portrait, you've partnered with KnowledgeWorks to develop the competencies and the continuum. What other changes has this profile precipitated? So if I were to infer from the work, it sounds like from an agency perspective, it's driving almost a nimbleness too.
Yeah, no, it's a great question. So I would actually say it's important to recognize that when our Portrait of a Graduate was approved at the agency level, there wasn't fireworks. There wasn't a parade. There wasn't then this slew of innovation and changes that came like the following month. I think it was something where people were like, whoa, okay, what is this? And it took us a while as an agency to be able to not just make sure that our agency membership and our agency team was really clear on what is the Portrait of a Graduate, but also to be able to build that communication process with the field. And so being able to go out and share this vision and start the conversation around, if this is our outcome and the goals of our stakeholders, what does that mean for your school? What does it mean for your classroom? What does it mean for your system? And to really begin that conversation organically, as opposed to coming out and being like, great, we have a Portrait of a Graduate and now we have competencies. And so we actually used those conversations about sharing the Portrait of a Graduate to help build the momentum that ultimately I think you see in our agency today. So some of those tangible outcomes for us include, we adopted a strategic plan at the agency that includes as one of our 4 main goals, personalized teaching and learning. And the goal behind that was really driven through Portrait of a Graduate and recognizing that kids are going to have different needs in these different characteristics. In addition to that, you often hear our board chair, Mark Huntsman, who often refers to our Portrait of a Graduate now as our North Star. That kind of framing has really taken off. And we see that being referred to and articulated not just now by State Board of Education members, but also by members of our legislature, as well as our greater teacher community. And so it's been really exciting to see not just the momentum grow in terms of what that Portrait of a Graduate means, but also when we start to create documents in terms of addressing, some of the concerns of the pandemic and equity and other spaces, we see those words, characteristics of Portrait of a Graduate, like respect, reappearing in those documents to be able to draw coherence in the conversation and make sure that as we're putting out resources, does it ultimately support us in getting kids to achieving this goal?
That is fantastic to hear, because if implemented, so the North Star language points to this, right? Is you've created sort of your guide rails, right? To say, as we think about change, as we kind of steward into whatever this new normal right? We have some principles at play here that we've agreed to adhere to. So I'm going to pivot just a moment because there's several fantastic questions coming in that are very much in line with the question bank that I had. So Brittany asks, what are 5 key questions posed to the stakeholder forum? So as you were working in this process, what might those questions have been?
Yeah. So we started off with a general question, which is, what are your aspirations for your children and your neighbors' children for their future? So we tried to leave it very open-ended to start. We recognize that a lot of folks coming in came for a purpose, right? When you hear the opportunity to inform the portrait of a graduate, you think to yourself, what's important to me and what's going to get me out the door and to the location to be able to make that statement. So we really wanted to give that first question to be very open-ended, to allow for stakeholders to bring that forward to the table, to recognize they had an opportunity to share it, and also to then be able to start then listening to others to be able to help inform their future responses. So that was our first main question. Our second question was specific to the family member joining. Our third question was again related to the workforce and what that looked like. We did ask another question about how will you know your child was successful upon post high school? So looking kind of more for what was that tangible piece they were looking for. Was it that they, were able to pursue, the post-secondary opportunities that they had in their vision? Or was it that, they were able to, move into a job sector that had immediate interest to them? So for us, kind of collecting what those expected outcome pieces was really important. The last kind of question we asked was, is there anything else that you see as being kind of key and important that we haven't already touched upon? Because we did it in as a design thinking mode, there were Post-it notes everywhere. So as people were generating ideas, they were putting those Post-it notes together to kind of show where similar ideas were emerging and forming. We collected all of those to help inform our themes. And then we also asked each stakeholder at the very end of the meeting to give us, if you could pick one characteristic, whether you developed it or not, to put on the portrait of a graduate that you would say is the most important to you, what would that be? And so then we collected all of that data as well to really help build what ultimately was our final portrait of a graduate.
Thank you. So Mike Sharp asks, are the competencies on progress reports or somehow communicated to parents as to where the students are on that rubric that you shared?
Yeah, it's a great question. So at this point, when it comes to our portrait of a graduate in Utah, there's probably another element that I should get out there really quickly before we go too far down a path of systems and compliance. So in our state, we have also encouraged our local LEAs to develop their own portrait of a graduate. So when we talk about that this is our state portrait of a graduate, it is not through the lens of this is it for everyone and there's no room for other conversation or iteration. In the same way that we are looking to develop more personalized learning opportunities for our kids, it's part of our approach and policy as well, is where is there opportunity for our local districts and our charter schools to be able to develop their portrait of a graduate with their community, and then to be able to use the state resources that align with their specific vision. So the example I always like to give is our partners in Iron County School District down in Cedar City, Utah. They had actually developed a portrait of a graduate prior to ours being completed. That was great. We fully support them within that space, and they fully supported the state in having a portrait of a graduate because they recognized that in the state advancing this vision actually supported their local vision in terms of giving them an exemplar to point to and a system of supports. As a part of that, they have been heavily involved in our development of both the competencies and the rubrics, not because they're going to take them as is carte blanche, but instead, because they can use them to realign the components that make sense with their portrait of a graduate as a great starting place to be able to begin the conversations with their teachers and their leaders. So to the original question, what does that look like as a parent? It's going to be different based on every LEA and every school, but it's something that as a state, we are now directly targeting with our LEAs. It had been kind of a adopt as you will kind of conversation, and we realized post-pandemic, we had a group of like the haves and the have-nots, those who had engaged and those who had not had that opportunity. So right now, the state is actually currently hosting workshops across the state, talking with LEAs, discussing what does Portrait of a Graduate mean for you, and what is your next step? Do you want to adopt the states, adapt the states? Do you want to create your own and then look to do a crosswalk alignment afterwards? We're supporting all of those pieces. It's more so about advancing the conversation about creating that shared vision with your stakeholders, and then what resources we can provide to help seed the effort to get it going faster.
That crosswalk, when this is all said and done, is going to be fascinating. And it's one of, I think, for me, one of the missed opportunities up to this point is that we're very fond of asking that vision question, right? And to do that crosswalk between all of the visions we've generated across all of the learning communities we've had the privilege of working with, to say, here's like the national commonality in terms of the Portrait of a Graduate work. So I'm really going to be looking forward to that. So one final question, Lars, thank you very much. And Lars asks, can you please share more about the relationship between your portrait and associated competencies and the Utah core standards? So in particular, do all standards map with the competencies? You addressed the second question. So do schools and educators orient their schools more around the competencies of the standards? That's a work in progress, it sounds like. And then the third piece he asks are, do data tracking systems in the school and district level track progress, both of students competing the competencies and the standards?
I like it. There's a lot in there. So let's break it down a little bit. So first and foremost, when it comes to our individual core standards, as well as our Portrait of a Graduate. So as we are going through core revision processes related to just in Utah, we have a timeline and expectation of revision every so many years based on board directives. One of the pieces that our developers for those core standards are looking at is Portrait of a Graduate. So looking for opportunities to be able to bring some of those elements in together and to be able to connect those pieces. I will note we haven't done an explicit, this competency is in this course only at this time. The reason we haven't done that is mainly because in Utah, as in many states, curriculum is a local control decision, and we really do defer to the LEAs in terms of looking at their existing structures, their existing high quality instructional materials, and doing that alignment at a local level, as opposed to having it prescribed to them at a state level. So again, we are looking for those opportunities for overlap and more direct reference, but it's not something that we're ever looking to necessarily say, of the 13 characteristics in the state model, here's exactly where they have to be taught. That's actually also why we designed the competencies in a grade banded fashion, was to provide that additional flexibility at the local level to say, you know, this component actually really makes sense for us in first grade, whereas in another school, it may make sense in second grade, and kind of having more of that, you know, flexibility within the existing piece. As far as moving forward into accountability, for what it's worth, the number one question when it comes to Portrait of a Graduate. So you will actually note in our Portrait of a Graduate, we lead with a statement that says not all of these characteristics are discrete and are intended to be measured. That was a very intentional statement that our State Board of Education included in 2018 because of that whole conversation around purpose and whether or not those characteristics were going to stay or go based on, could you measure accurate, and what does that look like? So as part of that, though, we have taken really big steps in that space. We are currently working with KnowledgeWorks as well as the Center for Assessment to be able to have great task force and focus group working on assessment and accountability, and gathering that stakeholder input in terms of, when you look at Portrait of a Graduate, what components should be included in our assessment and accountability, and which ones should not, and which ones that you are saying should be there, how do you capture those components, and what does that look like? So we expect to have an initial report related to those stakeholder conversations that have been taking place over the past year in July or August of 2022. And when we do, that's really what's going to inform our next steps in terms of iteration on our existing system to be able to draw more coherence across those documents.
So the journey is just getting started, right? So Ben asks, how are state officials and representatives learning more about how to directly support personalized competency-based practices in classrooms and schools? It's an excellent question, Ben.
It is. And for this one, I have to call out one of my colleagues. So Director of Teaching and Learning, Jennifer Thompson, really leads a lot of this work at the Utah State Board of Education. And recently, with the help of her team, they have started hosting site visits at some of the exemplar locations who've been in the personalized competency-based learning space. I think it is definitely not lost upon me in terms of sometimes you just have to see it. When we started off in this space, we actually followed that model, and we took our advisory board to multiple locations that were noted national exemplars in the personalized and competency-based learning space to be able to get a sense of what do those structures look like, what do those systems look like. But ultimately, it really came down to talking to their teachers and their kids, because when you speak with those students and you hear from them a very different tone in terms of their learning, their agency over their learning, their opportunities to design goals for their future and achieve those goals. Those are the things that really resonate with our educational leaders and our policymakers. And so I would give just a huge shout out to Jennifer in terms of that work and those opportunities to really visit those schools, because those are making transformational differences for our policymakers to really not only understand the idea, but become champions for it as well.
Absolutely. And that's been a tried and true both saying and approach here with KnowledgeWorks, where it is a hard thing to really describe. You have to know it, or you have to see it to know it. But once you see it, you can't unsee it. So it's once you lift that curtain back, it's a tough thing to go back to normal. So the last question we have here is from Mark, and Mark asks, is Utah going to move to a proficiency-based /mastery/competency delivery system, such as the Modern Classroom Project or the Westminster Unified School District or Lindsay Unified School District?
So I think part of that remains to be seen with the outcome of our current task force related to the assessment and the accountability effort. I will note that the state of Utah had engaged in an early partnership related to one of our competency-based learning grants with Mastery Transcript Consortium. And so as a part of that, the state had been providing opportunities for our districts and charter schools that were within the grant and within this space to be able to start to partner with MTC to figure out what would Mastery Transcript Consortium look like for you, and what would it look like for your school community and moving forward. I will note that the Utah legislature has taken action actually prior even to some of those MTC components, where they require that all of our Utah systems of higher education, so all of our state universities and technical colleges, are required by code to accept a competency-based learning transcript. And then we actually followed up with them in an additional year to get them to add language that says that those competency-based transcripts also also need to be acceptable in terms of awarding of financial aid and scholarships, so that we're really comprehensive in terms of most of our Utah kids, ultimately, we grow our own, go to our Utah schools and universities, and that they have a system of supports as they move into higher education.
That's fascinating. And actually, I had not known that the legislature had done that. So there's a continuum there, and I think that that's amazing. So Ben asks, are there policies already shifting at the state level or being considered to shift to support more PCBL practices?
Yeah, so right before the pandemic, February of 2020, oddly enough, we have our student, per pupil accounting rule that is a board policy, and clearly is a big one in terms of it directs resources. And we had previously had a policy around what we consider traditional and non-traditional, was the framing leading into February of 2020 related to how you start to capture student accounting and student participation in the system. So by traditional, we were referring to students in seats, in classrooms, in schools, being able to say they were there for the 990 hours, 180 days, et cetera. Non-traditional was an early attempt to start to capture some of those elements around online learning or even blended learning. And there was a quick call out for competency learning, although there wasn't really anything in there that kind of detailed, but what does that look like? So as a part of that, the board moved towards adopting, instead of traditional, non-traditional, which kind of starts to place value in some of these areas, two new kind of verbiage aspects. We have learner-centered, and we also have attendance validated. And so in looking at attendance validated, that could actually be an online system. It could be a brick and mortar system, but where you're using attendance in terms of being able to document the learning and the progress of students in terms of exposure in the system. However, you also now have another option, which is that learner validated, around being able to develop a policy at the local school level to say learner validated in our community is this, as approved by our local school board, and this is how we're going to provide outcomes to be able to account for student progress that may look a little different than the traditional were you in your seat for so many hours over the course of an academic year. So as part of that, that's just one example. It's a pretty big one. Anytime you're dealing with the funding model for education in a state, it's a big one. As one example of a policy that's changed in our state due to the conversations about personalized and competency-based learning.
So we've been talking about years of work, right? And happening at all levels of the education system and across many, many learning communities in Utah. Deep change is hard, right? It's iterative in nature. We never really stop. So at a time where everything is disrupted, nothing feels like it makes sense. What advice do you have for folks that are interested in undertaking the changes of the magnitude that you're pushing towards in Utah?
It's a great question. So I think the biggest thing that I would share is that in many, many, many ways, this was taking a chance. It was taking a chance on innovation. So when we started down the progress of Portrait of a Graduate, there were so many questions. Will it be included in standards? Will there be tests for it? What does that look like in accountability? What does this mean for every single teacher in every single classroom? And I'll be honest, in the state of Utah, we couldn't answer all of those questions at the time of development. And that was okay, because we knew that in taking a step forward towards gathering input and gathering voice, it illuminated the next step forward. So I think the biggest lesson learned that I would share for anyone who's interested within this space is you have to come at it through a mindset that you won't know all the answers right away. and that that's okay. And it is okay to say, we're going to take our first step of convening stakeholders and starting to gather information about what does a high school diploma mean to our community, to our state. And then once we get that information, we can capture it in a document. We can put that document back out and get more stakeholder input on it before we move to finalize it. And then in finalizing it, you're not finalizing any and all changes for the system from now until perpetuity, but instead you're really just illuminating the next step forward to be able to then have the conversation. Okay, if this is our vision, how do we make it reality? And I think that's going to look different in every state based on the stakeholders who are involved in the systems you're engaged in. So I would just really encourage anyone who's interested to really start with that mindset of, I'm going to take a step forward. I'm not going to know the end destination, and that's okay. And that as part of taking that step forward, I'm going to start with my stakeholders, and I'm going to talk to them. And if I can highlight one group, I'm going to talk to my kids. I'm going to talk to my students who are in the system, and I'm going to give them an opportunity to say, this is what we need. So that would be my recommendation to anyone considering this work.
I appreciate that so much. A lot of times when we're faced with these critical choice points and making change, we tend to our minds go to what could go wrong. Right? And we perseverate on that. And it's a worthy question to ask, don't get me wrong, but equally as important should be, well, what happens if this goes right? Which we're not always asked these questions of what do we want and how might we be able to achieve that? It's more of we want to mitigate against what's uncertain and what doesn't feel quite right. So I have to applaud you and the state for doing this deep work and starting with that terrific question in mind of, how might we lead with empathy in this? So my last formal question, I should say, is more of a personal question in nature. And that is from the standpoint of a citizen of Utah, as somebody doing this transformational work, Sarah, what is your own personal vision for the future of learning or the future of education?
Yeah, it's a great question. So for me, it honestly comes down to the fact that I have a child in the system. And I have nieces and nephews in the system. And I have neighbors and other community members and friends who all have kids within this space. And when we talk about what we want our future to look like, that only becomes a reality if you really create opportunities for them to build these characteristics. When I look at Portrait of a Graduate, the thing that always got me most excited, and to this day gets me most excited about it, is I look at every one of those 13 characteristics and I say, as a parent, I want that for my child. I want my child to have competency in these 13 areas. And I feel incredibly strongly about that, clearly in the work that we do with my colleagues at the State Board of Education. But when we talk about then, so what's your vision for the future? It's truly that there is a system that allows for all of our kids, not just my child, not just my nieces and nephews, not just my neighbors' children, but to really be in a space where they have that opportunity to develop and become competent in these 13 characteristics. Because if you look at our Portrait of a Graduate, you can say to yourself, what would it look like to live in a society where all 13 of these characteristics were valued and achieved for our kids upon high school graduation? It would look incredibly different than it does today. And so that's really my vision, is being able to create the systems to foster these opportunities for all of our students in Utah and all of our families, because ultimately that is what creates the society that I hope for the future.
What a beautiful, rich picture of the future. Just to simply put, what would happen if, all of these skills, qualities, dispositions were manifested uniformly. And I really, really appreciate that, Sarah. So working with LEAs to develop their POGs, developing the competencies and continuums, thinking differently about assessment. Is there anything else that's going on under the the big hood of learning innovation in Utah that you would like to share?
Yeah, so there is one other component. So a lot of times we share Portrait of a Graduate, and the general reactions are, yes, love it, can't wait, let's do this, all kids, which is then followed with a ... And after that ... comes, okay, but then what can I do? Like, what's next? Like, what does that look like for me? How do I start fostering these opportunities? And so within the state, we've had a multitude of stakeholders, as well as leaders at the Utah State Board of Education, who've created the personalized competency-based learning framework. That particular framework seeks to really capture then, if this is our goal, which is the Portrait of a Graduate, what does it need to look like in classrooms? And what does it look like through the lens of students, of educators, of families, in terms of being able to foster these opportunities for our children? And so I think that particular document, known as the PCBL framework in the state of Utah, really provides the how. And so I just like to highlight that as another key component and aspect to kind of the ecosystem of the work that's happening here in Utah, because it's great to have a vision. And it's great to have resources that support LEAs in developing their vision and taking next steps. But ultimately, you've got to have a foundational document that addresses your how, and being able to really then discuss what are those tangible next steps, what are those shifts in those areas. We also have an assessment tool that allows for LEAs to go through and say, what aspects of the framework do we already have in place in our LEA? Which ones do we not? To be able to then start to identify what those next steps look like. So just taking a moment to highlight that as well. All of these resources are available through our website, PCBL framework, and we're happy to share with KnowledgeWorks to follow up.
Terrific. Thanks, Sarah. So keeping an eye on time, I was wondering if you might share how any ways folks could get in contact with you should they want to follow up on the work or with questions about any of the initiatives.
You bet. So again, as far as contact goes, so Sarah Young, I know they've shared my email in the chat, but for those who may be viewing the recording, it's just Sarah, SARAH.Young, YOUNG, at schools.utah.gov. In addition to that, as far as our website goes, all of our work is available at our website, which is www.schools.utah.gov. And that'll take you to our Utah State Board of Education website, where you can search for Portrait of a Graduate, which is one of our banner items on the main page. You can also look for PCBL framework, the competency-based learning grants, our competencies, our rubrics, they're all there. And we're happy to either share those through the website, or you're welcome to follow up with me directly. And I'm happy to connect you, whether to myself or some of the other great experts at the agency who are leading this work.
Cool. Thank you, Sarah. And with our remaining time, I want to put out a final call for questions for any of the participants or listeners in our final few minutes. So Eric asks, has it been easy for LEAs to take what you've done and tailor it to their own situations and circumstances? You should really consider this a success, and I would definitely agree.
Well, thank you. It's a great question. And I think it's one where we're still probably gauging those responses. I will note that when we developed the competencies as well as the rubrics, we did a call to the community for the developers within those spaces. In that development work, we were really intentional and thoughtful about making sure that we were including leaders and representatives from across the state. So because we were hosting these development efforts in a Zoom setting, we really did get a lot of diversity in terms of geographic kind of diversity, as well as grade level diversity, subject matter expertise diversity, and different roles and responsibilities. So in addition to having teachers and district leaders there and principals, we also had parents, we had university professors, we had members of industry participate in the development of the actual competencies, as well as the development development of those rubrics. So really one of our efforts in that space to try and make them as flexible as possible was through the lens of incorporating those stakeholders in the development phase. So their lenses could not only be a part of it and imprinted on the final document, but also so that they had familiarity in what it took to develop those and what was considered, so they could bring that back to hopefully really jumpstart those conversations at the level. We've seen more success in those LEAs that again had participants in the development phase in terms of taking those next steps towards what does it look like for me, than we have with maybe some of our LEAs that didn't necessarily have a developer in that space.
Terrific. Thank you, Sarah. So I think on that note, we're about out at time. So one, thank you, Sarah, for spending an hour with us and sharing your state's journey. To all of those listening and joining us from all across the country, thank you so much for spending your hour with us. It's humbling and we appreciate it. We will send out to all those who are registered all the links that we can muster out of the chat box and a brief thank you and summary of the conversation. And once again, Sarah, just thank you, and thank you for all you're doing to improve the lives of young people in Utah.
Awesome. Jason, thanks for the opportunity to highlight the work in Utah. And if I can just close by saying a huge shout out to the amazing team in Utah. Whether you work for the agency, whether you were a developer, whether you were a stakeholder who came to participate, every single individual who's touched this document has really made a difference. And I'm just super grateful to belong to a state where there's so many people invested in K-12 education.
Terrific. Thank you.